The Yu-Gi-Oh meta has changed once again, and you need to know which hand traps are the most important to beat the best meta decks. What's potion? You got Matt here, and welcome to another competitive Yu-Gi-Oh video. Today we're talking about hand traps post Legacy of Destruction and how they interact with the best meta decks. The new releases have changed the format with decks like Tenpai Dragon and Melodious entering the meta, and with a bunch of other new decks receiving support as well. So today we're going to find out which hand traps are the best against those strategies and rank them. So if you're excited for the video, then make sure to smash the like button. If this video hits 300 likes, I'll bring you the ultimate guide on the best board breakers post Legacy of Destruction. Also, if you like competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, including deck profiles, guides on how to beat the best decks, meta discussions, and videos just like this one, you're gonna love this channel, so make sure to subscribe. But with that being said, here is your guide to the best hand traps in the post Legacy of Destruction competitive Yu-Gi-Oh format. Let's jump into it. When talking about these hand traps, we're going to organize them into different categories to find out which ones are the best for the current format. And as always, I have 6 different categories to look at, and I urge you to look at the names of the categories because they are important. The 6 categories we're going to talk about are going to be playable in most main decks, playable in some main decks, playable in most side decks and in some side decks, as well as niche and just don't. Now, just because one card is in a specific tier doesn't mean it's necessarily better than all the other cards in the tiers below it. It really comes down to what the format is looking at to define how good these cards actually are. Anyways, let's jump into the list in alphabetical order, starting off with Artifact Lancea. There have been some formats where Lancea has performed very well, but unfortunately we're not in the format where it can do well today. Preventing banishing can be really good because a lot of decks want to utilize banishing to get either interruption or be able to activate powerful effects. But the problem with Artifact Lancea is that it can only be used during their opponent's turn. Because in modern Yu-Gi-Oh decks are easily able to do actions on both players' turns, it makes it so that Artifact Lancea really isn't as strong as it could be. But it does have a decent time against decks like Runic. It's also pretty good against the Saphira effect to banish itself to perform a ritual summon. It's also really solid against Branded in certain situations as well, and honestly, most decks have some issues dealing with Artifact Lancea at times. It's just that there are so many better options that can do the job more consistently than Artifact Lancea. I want to put it in just don't, but it has enough utility to go in the niche tier. Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring has been a staple hand trap in the main decks for pretty much its entire lifetime. It is so good at hitting these generic effects that would either send from deck to graveyard, add from deck to hand, or special directly from the deck. It's good against pretty much every single deck in the format today, whether it's going to be on Fire King Island or on something like Snake Eye Ash. It's good against pre-preparation of rights, it's good against Branded Fusion, and even on Sangan Summoning or Sangan Kaiman, especially in the battle phase. And because of how common the effects it negates actually are, it's able to see play even against rogue strategies as well. But that's not to say it doesn't have its weaknesses. A lot of decks already have built-in ways to play around Ash Blossom right now, either by activating directly from the deck or placing it or even setting it directly to your side of the field. It's also an incredibly common play, especially in this format where fire decks are so good, for your opponent to link into a copy of Hita the Fire Charmer, take the copy of Ash Blossom that you used, and then continue their plays from there. But even with all that, Ash Blossom is still just so incredibly strong and generic that it can do so many good things on your opponent's turn that it kind of has to see play in pretty much every deck. And that's especially in this format, not only because hand traps are so dominant, but because so many decks are able to play at least 12 to 15 spots for hand traps. Ash Blossom has an argument for being the strongest and most generic hand trap in the game today, and for that reason it's playable in most main decks. The Bystials have always been very format dependent cards. Back in light and dark based formats like Tierlist, they saw play in pretty much every main deck. But when we moved to Kashtira format, when more non-light and dark attributes were coming around, they weren't seeing that much play. And now they're kind of back. Not necessarily as a main deck threat, but definitely in the side deck right now. Pretty much every single deck has at least one card they really don't want to be hit with Bystials. Think of a deck like Snake Eye. They really don't want to see their Diabell Stars get banished, or more importantly, their IP Masquerena, because they then can't bring it back with the effect of the Flamberge Dragon. You look at a deck like Branded and Voiceless Voice, pretty much their entire engines are all light and dark monsters, which means they can all be hit with something like a Bystial, and that's very problematic. Pretty much every top tier deck has at least one line that's pretty weak to a Bystial, except for decks like Runic Stun because honestly they just don't care, and of course Tenpai Dragon because they're all fire dragon monsters, so your opponent can't actually use the Bystials to interrupt you. And yeah, some Bystials like Magnamut are seeing some play in the main deck, but that's mostly being used as actual engine pieces in Tenpai Dragon or Dragon Link or Bystial Runic, for example. They're not really being used as traditional hand traps. So unless Bystials are part of your actual engine, they belong in the playable in most side decks tier. Chaos Hunter is so situational and really not that strong. We put Artifact Lancea in the niche tier because honestly it just doesn't do enough, and Chaos Hunter is kind of the same thing. Oh, and on top of that, it causes you to discard a card to summon it out, so you're going -1 on the exchange. Most hand traps are able to trade equally in card advantage or give you at least a virtual card advantage, while Chaos Hunter doesn't really do that. Just don't play it. So Contact C can be pretty good against a few decks in the format, notably Tenpai Dragon and Branded, but against the rest of the decks it's pretty weak. And honestly, even against these decks I mentioned in Tenpai and Branded, they have outs to using Contact C to be able to get rid of it for their plays to continue. Tenpai Dragon can link off with it with any of their dragon monsters to create SP Little Knight or a Hita for example and continue their plays. They can also use a level 4 tuner monster in Chandra to be able to synchro off into a generic level 10 like Ruddy Rose Dragon. And while Branded doesn't want to use cards on the field for their fusion summons, they definitely can, and there are options to fuse away the Contact C. And against every other deck in the format, it can be used as free material for SP Little Knight or as cost for something like Forbidden Droplet for example. Contact C is not good right now, so just don't play this card. DD Crow is in a really interesting position because there's no doubt that it's actually a good card, but the question is it good enough? It can stop a bunch of problematic cards in the graveyard in the fire matchups like Promethean Princess or Flamberge Dragon, Barong, Garunix, and so on, and it can also stop a lot of the cards that the Bystials would stop as well. But DD Crow just isn't as good as them. Why though? Well, the Bystials offer two things that DD Crow doesn't. The first of which is going to be it gives them an actual body on the field which can be used for link plays, synchro plays, Xyz plays, whatever the case might be. And the second reason is going to be because they all offer additional effects as well. Magnuma can replace itself, Druid's Worm can send cards on the field to the graveyard, and Baldrake can help deal with extra deck monsters as well. As good of a card as DD Crow is, it just isn't good enough, and feel free to flame me in the comments for this take, but for right now, I actually believe that DD Crow is a niche card. Moving on to Dimension Shifter. I swear, every single time I make a hand trap tier list, Dimension Shifter falls into the exact same tier, and it's for good reason. Shifter is a fantastic card, but not every single deck can actually play it. The ones that can though, love it. I'm talking about decks like Fluon Deriz, Kashtira, and even Vanquish Soul to an extent as well. Then there are some decks that can play it but don't always want to do so. I'm talking about decks like Purely and Tenpai Dragon among others. But then you have some decks that just can't play it under any circumstance because it shuts off their own engine as well. So while in my opinion it's a ban-worthy card and arguably the strongest card on this list, it's a card that just can't be played in every deck because of what it actually does for a strategy. And because of that, it's only going to see play in some main decks. Droll and Lockbird is up next, and in my last tier list I might have gotten a little bit ahead of myself. Droll is the best hand trap in the format. Yeah, that didn't age so well. But I wasn't completely wrong. Droll and Lockbird is able to stop a lot of decks that would really kind of just go absolutely crazy from entering the format. If Droll didn't exist, we'd have pretty much every deck just vomit their entire hand onto the field, draw a bunch of cards, FTK, and whatever the case might be. Droll is very important for that reason, but it's not as good as I had made it out to be in the past. Some decks are still able to play around Droll and Lockbird kind of the same way they can play around Ash Blossom, by either directly activating cards from the deck, or by setting them, or even by using cards in the draw phase where Droll and Lockbird can't be used. But most decks are usually at least a little bit annoyed by it, or their entire turn completely ends. For example, decks like Fire King really don't like it, especially if they start off with a Ponyx, because Ponyx will add them their copy of Sanctuary, which means that they can't activate their effective island to search for a card as well. But a deck like Voiceless Voice does search a few times in their turn, but depending on the hand, they don't really care too much. And then you have a deck like Branded, which is kind of the same thing because a lot of the time their searches all happen at the exact same time. And then we have decks like Tenpai Dragon and Snake Eye, which can definitely play around it because they either have effects that they can use in the draw phase, or they just don't need to search more than one time in a given turn. In many other formats, Droll would be a side deck staple, but right now, because so many decks are able to play at least 12 to 15 hand traps in their main deck, it's possible they decide to incorporate 2 to 3 copies of Droll to stop other strategies. And even with all these decks that play a ton of hand traps, if it's not in the main deck, it's usually going to be in the side. But at this point, I'm having a really hard time deciding where I want this card to go. Is it going to go in the most side decks tier or in the some main decks tier? It's a really tough call. but for now I think I'll place it in the playable in most side decks tier. Effect Veiler offers targeted effect negation, which is great in almost any format. But especially in a format like we have right now where so many hand traps are seeing play, Effect Veiler is just one of the better ones because it's not a hard once per turn, and it's also easily able to negate some problematic cards. Almost every single deck in the format has at least one card they really don't want to be hit with an infinite impermanence, and Effect Veiler can kind of do the exact same thing. But the problem with Effect Veiler is that it can only be activated during your opponent's main phase, and it also can't be used under Dimension Shifter. It also turns on triple tactic talents, and it can be dodged by some other cards as well, so it's not as good as a lot of other hand traps, but it's still seeing a lot of play because hand traps are just that good in this format. But at least Veiler is a spellcaster monster, which means you can use Selene with access code Talker to create a pretty good OTK with this card. I'd like to put it higher up, but for now, Veiler belongs in the some main decks tier. After covering Effect Veiler, I like to move on to Infinite Impermanence, and while they're similar cards, Imperm is miles better than Effect Veiler. Not only is it a card that can be used on either player's turn during any phase, it can't be hit with something like Call by the Grave, and it's also a card that doesn't turn on thrust and talents, which is very key. Imperm can also be used as a board breaker, and it isn't once per turn. It's honestly the perfect hand trap right now because, like I said with Veiler, every single deck has at least one card that is going to be weak to Infinite Impermanence or targeted effect negation in general. If you're playing hand traps in your deck this format, you have to be playing Infinite Impermanence. Imperm belongs in the most main decks tier. Fantastical Dragon Phantazmay should never see main deck play ever again. The card was very good once upon a time, but honestly, since the Master rule changes, it has kind of fallen off pretty significantly. It's not a bad card by any means, but it is very situational. Your opponent has to be playing a link-based strategy for you to easily summon it out, and yes, you want them to be able to target cards as well, because if they don't, you can't use the beneficial effect of Fantastical Dragon Phantazmay while it's on the field. But I'll say the same thing I said last time, and that's that Phantazmay is being used right now in the side deck as ways to help dig for more side deck cards that would be good against certain matchups. So for that reason, Phantazmay should see play in some side decks. I like Ghost Belle and Haunted Mansion a lot this format, especially because it can be used against pretty much every single deck in the format, and because it negates activations and not effects, it can be used in the damage step on the effect of Fadra in Tenpai Dragon. It's great against Flamber's Dragon trying to revive back 2 level 1 fire monsters, it's awesome against Lo that tries to revive itself, and then you have Branded, which can't gimmick puppet lock you if you have Ghost Belle, or they may not even be able to get that far in the first place. So for that reason, I'm placing Belle in the playable in some main decks tier. Ghost Mourner is arguably the second or third best targeting hand trap we have in the format today. It's really good because it can be used on either player's turn, regardless of if you have cards or not, but it's pretty situational because it can only be used when your opponent would special summon that monster, so it doesn't really come up as a chainable card in a lot of situations. It's still seeing a lot of play, especially in decks like Tenpai Dragon or Snake Eyes for example, because they have a lot of space for non-engine, but let's take a deeper look at it. How often do you see Ghost Mourner in this side deck? Almost never. It's very much a main deck only card. Sure, you can see it time to time in side decks, but most of the time it's going to be in the main deck. So while I don't think it's as good as a lot of the other cards that are going to end up in this tier, it belongs in the some main decks tier. Ghost Ogre will have the biggest rise from where it was on my last tier list onto this one. This card has a massive glow up and it's become so much better in this particular format. In my last hand trap tier list, Ghost Ogre was in the niche tier, and I stand by that. But it's gone so much better in this particular format for a few reasons. There are so many amazing field spells and continuous spells in the game today that are weak to Ghost Ogre, so having that in the format is really important. It can be used against Fire King Island, assuming there's no Sanctuary. It's really solid against something like the Divine Temple of the Snake Eye if they're trying to use the effect to special summon from the spell and trap zone. It can stop Sangan summoning from resolving and get rid of it as well to make the Tenpai Dragons weak to cards in the main phase again, and it can also be chained to the Tenpai Dragon effects to quick synchro as well, getting rid of the body that they would need to get that effect online. It's a solid card against the Voiceless Voice continuous spells and trap cards. It's pretty good against Purely 2, which will be a much more accessible deck after Rarity Collection 2 releases, and it's great against some more generic cards in the format today, like IP and SP Little Knight. This is the format that brings Ghost Ogre back into the meta in a big way. I think it belongs in some main decks. Ghost Reaper in theory is a great card, but in practice it just really never comes up. Even in more tier 0 formats where one extra deck card is kind of dominating the format, like Kid Kalos for example, it never ended up doing work. so honestly, just don't play it. As for Ghost Sister and Spooky Dogwood, it's not a good card in my opinion, but it does its job very well, and that's to be a great side deck option when you're going late into the game. Having a life point advantage is very important when it comes to Yu-Gi-Oh, and Ghost Sister can definitely do that job pretty well, assuming you draw it. Not every deck can or even wants to play Dogwood, but I believe it belongs in some side decks. Gnomaterial is still a bad card, please just don't play it. Nibiru is a great card in a very interesting spot. You would think that with Baronne de Fleur and Borreload Savage Dragon being banned, it would see a lot more play, and that's definitely true. But those cards were replaced with PSY-Frame Lord Omega, which can make Nibiru useless if it gets ripped out of the hand. But even with the risk of Omega, there are some decks that still have a really hard time dealing with Nibiru. Depending on the hand, decks like Snake Eye, Fire King, Branded, even Voiceless Voice can have a tough time dealing with a Nib at the right moment. It's a good card but can be completely useless against so many decks in the format today. It does nothing against Runic or Tenpai Dragon, even Labyrinth, and there's also those decks that make Appaloosa before it's optimal to use Nibiru in the first place. Placing Nibiru on the tier list was the hardest decision I had to make because there's so much potential upside, but there's also so much potential downside. But after a long debate, I've decided to put Nibiru in the some main decks tier. PSY-Framegear Gamma is a great card but can only be played by very specific decks, so for that reason, it's a niche card. Retaliating Sea is a very weak card. Most of the time you can find a better card than Retaliating Sea in any given matchup. Just don't play it. Sauravis, the Ancient and Ascendant, is an engine card in Voiceless Voice, and sure, it can come up as being a great option as an anti-hand trap in a way, but it doesn't come up often enough for it to be worth playing in other strategies. I'll gladly admit if I'm wrong, but for now, Sauravis is just fine, so it goes in the niche tier. Moving on to Meister. Look, I realize it has potential. It's not a hard once per turn, the effects it can stop are all pretty good, but honestly, it just doesn't do enough. Most of the time, the effects you're going to be using it on could be covered by something like Ash or Ghost Belle, DD Crow, or even a Bystials, so honestly I don't really see the appeal of it that much, but it does have some potential, so for that reason Meister belongs in the niche tier. Please don't play Token Collector this format. And our final hand trap is going to be Veidos, the Eruption Dragon of Extinction. Look, field spells are going to be very good in this format, and they're going to keep getting better. The majority of the field spells right now are going to be hit by something like Ghost Ogre, which has crossover with other cards as well. So Veidos may not be the most popular option to play for the time being, but I want to get ahead of the curve when it comes to Veidos. It's a strong card, there's no doubt about it, and it's going to see some play. So for that reason, I'm going to put it in the some side decks tier. And that is it. My tier list for the best hand traps in the post Legacy of Destruction competitive format is looking like this over here. Let me know what you guys thought about it down in the comments below, and if you thought I made any mistakes, and we'll have a discussion about it. If you made it this far in the video, you must have enjoyed it, so make sure to smash the like button, and of course subscribe to the channel for more amazing competitive Yu-Gi-Oh videos. Check out my sponsor, Imperium Duelist, and use code OSHEA10, OSHEA10 for 10% off your purchase. And follow me on Twitter and join the Discord server, both of which are linked in the description. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next time.